to episode 38 of the Bible Connection podcast. So this is a weekly podcast that follows our church's Bible reading plan that we might encourage you not to give up on reading your Bibles this year. So I'm your host, Josh Williams, and with me are some of my good friends, Brandon Stooksbury.
Hello.
Taylor Babcock.
Hey.
John Steinke.
Hey there.
So guys, this week we are going to be discussing Daniel, and specifically this week, we're going to change it up a little bit. What we decided as a group was, since we're going through so many books, and we like Joel or Amos or Obadiah, they're going to be a little bit smaller. So what we decided as a group was, we're gonna each person here on the podcast is going to dive deep into their specifics. So this week, Brandon's gonna head up Daniel. Next episode is
I'll
gonna
be doing Hosea.
Yeah, Hosea, John, and then Taylor's knocking out Joel.
That's me.
So we're mainly going to hear from Brandon this time. So, John, Taylor, you guys feel free to hop in if you ever, if you have something you want to say. But we're excited to see what Brandon has prepared for us in Daniel. So,
Glad you are.
I enjoyed Daniel thoroughly this week. So, Brandon, before we break down the book of before you break down the book of Daniel for us, it'd be helpful to get a refresher on the historical context. So, can you bring us up to speed on the setting and time period of Daniel?
Yeah. So the last few weeks we've looked at Jeremiah. We looked at Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Lamentations before that, and we saw how these prophets functioned as covenant prosecutors, and we've talked about how where they fell within Israel's timeline, and we saw that Israel was because of their disobedience to Yahweh, Judah had already been taken. Israel had already been taken out into exile, and then later Judah was carried into exile because of their disobedience, and we saw in those earlier prophets that some pretty striking language. Judah was compared to Sodom and Gomorrah. There were passages that talked about how the wickedness of Judah had become worse than Israel. And something we didn't pick up on, because there was so much to talk about in Jeremiah, but there's Daniel.
We only had we went an hour almost. Yeah, and there's still more to talk about.
I know, but in Jeremiah, one of the things that we didn't get to talk about was Jeremiah's prophecy of that there would be 70 years in exile, and you might think, where is this just an arbitrary number? Well, if you look back at the Torah, you'll see that that every 7 years the land was to get, every 7 years there was to be, one of those years was to be a year would be a jubilee year, and the land itself would rest. And we're told in these prophets that one of the things that they, along with their wickedness, one of the things that they didn't do is they didn't let their land rest. And so what God does is he says there's going to be 77s, right? There's this. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. There's going to be these 70 years, right? To basically, and there's some deeper stuff in that, because you remember when Israel, we talked about this months ago, Israel was coming into the land. We read in Deuteronomy and places that God was going to vomit the land. The land was going to vomit the nations out of that land because they had polluted the land, right? Because of their iniquities. And we see that these prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, have told them the same thing as they're, with Isaiah, the time is coming. Jeremiah, the time is upon us. Ezekiel, it's here. It's coming. It's too late. And so we see now that the land is vomiting, just like it had done with the nations before Israel. Now it's vomiting Israel up. And Daniel is telling us, Daniel comes Ezekiel is in Babylon. We learn about that in the book of Ezekiel. Daniel actually is before. He goes into Babylon probably 10 years before Ezekiel gets there. So we see that we see God's providence in that Daniel he's in the high court. I mean, he's a man in high places, and is basically there and is probably making provisions for the Jewish exiles as they come into the land. So we see even in the midst of suffering and judgment, God is still making provisions for His people. So.
Real quick, so does Daniel I read a commentary. Does Daniel fall in that time of that 70-year mark?
Yes. So Daniel's writing and lifetime is encapsulating that 70 years of exile.
His exile begins the 70 years, and then the end of the story of Daniel is the end of that 70 years.
That's when he's wondering, like, preparing. Why are we not preparing to get out of this, right?
Yeah, so you could almost look at it like if Jeremiah is prophesying that the 70 years are coming, Daniel tells the story, and Chronicles is the explanation of the return from exile.
Nice. Okay, so there are many things we could discuss about the book of Daniel on a podcast like this, but I want to look at the big picture. What is the message of Daniel, and what do I need to know before I read the book of Daniel so I don't miss the point?
Well, what do you need to know before you read the book of Daniel? Well, you need to know Deuteronomy 38, where there is cursings for not following the law, and what's going on with that, and the purpose of exile. You need to know, like we just said, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Really, the sections in Jeremiah, Isaiah 53, 54, the covenant of peace, the suffering servant, and then when you get to Jeremiah 31, you need to understand what the new covenant is, because the new covenant is shedding. Jeremiah 31 is shedding light on what Isaiah is talking about, the ministry of the suffering servant. And then you get to Ezekiel in the covenant of peace and the valley of dry bones and the resurrection. We're told in that Israel is to be given a new heart in 36, and then in chapter 37 that there's going to be a new birth that comes. And then also at the end of Ezekiel's letter in 40 through 48, that there's this coming temple. And I made a statement. You asked me something the last time we were here on Ezekiel, and you said, should 40 through 48 be interpreted symbolically? I'm going to stand by what I said. I think it absolutely should be interpreted symbolically, because if you look at the temple, if you look at the tabernacle and its progression to the temple, right? What was the purpose of the temple? That God's Spirit was there, right? What happened when God's Spirit left the temple? We see, and it's carried off the first time. Eli has a grandson, and the mother names the son Ichabod. The glory has departed, right? And then. Going on, so there's the temple. Jesus in his ministry is self-identifying as the temple, especially in John's gospel, and that this new temple, Jesus himself is going to be the temple and all of its the things that went on in it. The book of Hebrews tells us we're types and shadows, right? When Jesus comes, we see what everything in the temple was pointing to. He was literally God dwelling amongst men, right? We didn't, that's what John is talking about in his prologue. So, but that's kind of the big picture. You see that, but in Daniel, you get these visions, or you get these stories. Daniel taken into Babylon, Daniel's faithfulness. You see, there's Daniel, along with some of his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and why we use their Babylonian names and not their Hebrew names.
I am curious about that, because Daniel's Babylonian name is Belshazzar, or is that how you say it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Why do they go by their Babylonian names?
Yeah. So
Esther and Hadassah as well.
Yeah. So we could go down the rabbit hole here, but just know, don't separate Daniel from everything else we know. What happens in the scriptures when someone's name changes? What's going on?
Like,
there's a covenant.
Like Paul's changed his name.
There's a covenant going on,
right.
And what Babylon is trying to do is kind of a covenant, but in the wrong way, right? So, and we see that though Babylon is trying to undo what Yahweh has done in these boys, we see that through what they eat to how they worship, that Babylon can't break these four young men,
right?
So because God's Spirit is in them. Were you going to ask me something else?
I was thinking of something else, but I'm just going to
don't ask me about the food, because I have no idea why.
I was
why
about
they're given.
Yeah.
Why
The point is, it's an actual miracle when veganism works.
Yes. Yeah, and they're called fatter than the other men, and that has to be a miracle, because they ain't nobody getting fat eating vegetables.
Yeah.
But anyway,
rabbit food.
Yeah, I do like vegetables, though.
One quick comment I'd like to make, too. When we talk about the Bible and the languages that make up the Bible, we say Hebrew for the Old Testament and Greek for the New Testament. And that's true-ish. There's also a third language that's present, a little bit in Genesis when Jacob is talking with his father-in-law Laban. But here in Daniel, Aramaic kind of comes into the text right to the middle of the book of Daniel. It's actually written in a language called Aramaic, which is very close to Hebrew. Like, imagine a Spanish person listening to a Portuguese person. They could probably pick up a few words, but if you talk quickly, you'd have no clue what's going on. So this Aramaic...
Or somebody that speaks English talking to somebody from Boston.
Okay, yeah, something like that. That might be too far. But when you talk about, like, Aramaic in the middle of the text, and you're getting some perspectives from even the king of Babylon, his words in the text... this is also kind of the language root that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come from, and as their story introduces the portion of the book of Daniel that's in Aramaic, that might be why traditionally the Aramaic names were being used, whereas Daniel's introduced at the beginning of the story when it was written in Hebrew. So.
Yeah, and something else that we need to know about the book of Daniel, a lot of times when we think about apocalyptic literature, a lot of times what comes into our mind is like horror movies, right? And Miles Van Pelt in his overview of the Old Testament lectures, he said that apocalyptic was ancient Near Eastern comfort food. And I was like, what? And as I thought about it, I was like, yeah, because in using language like after the miracle of the boys getting fatter, eating vegetables and water, you get into these dreams and visions, and some of them are pretty wild on what's going on. And what this is showing us is that that in these visions, Yahweh is still king. Right? There may be, Nebuchadnezzar may have this massive ego where he's gonna, burn up three boys for not worshiping, his image, but the Son of God is going to be in the midst of the fire.
Yeah, he just wanted to have a conference with them, and it just happened to be that.
You know what I'm saying? So you see, in that is setting the stage for the rest of the book, right? And throughout these things, God's people were given these things to comfort. Originally, God's people were given these things to comfort them in the midst of exile. So moving, different images, and there's what's interesting is there's images, Nebuchadnezzar's statue, there's temple language that's there, so he may be borrowing from what was going on in the temple, and basically it looked way more blasphemous to these three boys in real time than it looks to us, because of what's being borrowed there. Even the image there, the Salim. Anyway,
What's Salim?
Image.
Oh, okay.
Yep. So Nebuchadnezzar is making a gigantic colossus of himself
Because he misinterpreted what Daniel said to him about his dream, right?
Yeah.
I think it's more of not a misinterpretation as much as like selective hearing. You're
I
gonna be the greatest of all
better way to say
kings.
it.
It's like, okay, so I should make the whole world bow to my image, and that's not at all that he was being told.
Yeah.
Pride had a little bit to do with it.
Yeah. And you get into Nebuchadnezzar's seeing the. I mean, it's Jesus. It's this. He calls it the one like the Son of God, or depending on what translation you have. In chapter 3, verse 25. And he answered and said, "But I see four men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt in their appearance, and the appearance of the fourth is like a son of the gods." If you have a King James, it'll say son of God. We know from later revelation that Jesus is there among them. And then this leads Nebuchadnezzar to see, in chapter 4, verse 1, it said, "King Nebuchadnezzar, to all people and the nations and languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied to you. And it seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation." Well, what's interesting is that is very similar to the language that's used at the end of chapter 7. In chapter 7, verse 27, it says, after it says here that the superscription over this, the Son of Man is given dominion. In verse 27, it says, "And the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven should be given to the people of the saints of the Most High God. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all his dominions shall serve and obey him." So, so Nebuchadnezzar sees the greatness of Yahweh, right, and he begins to praise him, and then he goes into second dream. You see, after there's talk of a tree, and this gigantic tree and rocks and all this stuff, and then Nebuchadnezzar is humbled, and then after Nebuchadnezzar is restored again, you see this same type of language. "For his dominion is an everlasting dominion; his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are nothing." Are counted as nothing, and he does all he does according to his will among the hosts of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" So, the most powerful king that the earth has had known at that time is giving praise to Yahweh, right? And some commentators argue did Nebuchadnezzar become a follower of Yahweh? And it seems as though he did, but I'm not. It's not a hill I'm going to die on. After Nebuchadnezzar, his son begins to reign, Belshazzar, and he's not. He doesn't do well, right? Mm-hmm. So he basically begins taking things from the temple and basically, so at this time you have to understand that Babylon was under siege, right? So constantly. So, and what outside the walls? Who were outside? Who was outside the walls, John? When Babylon was under siege.
When Babylon was under siege?
Yeah.
The Persians and the Medes?
Yep. So because his name comes up here, Darius. All right. Yep, in chapter 6. But anyway, so what was going on in the midst? The reason that Belshazzar is throwing this great feast, and it says for thousands, and his lords drank wine in front of the thousand. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of God and the silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem be brought, and the kings and the lords and wives and concubines might drink from them. So what was going on here? It seems as though that they weren't just throwing this big shindig. They weren't throwing this big shindig just for grins. They were under siege, and they knew they were about to be taken down. And this was it seems as though this was like a last ditch effort to appeal to Yahweh in the pantheon of gods to save them. And instead of Yahweh saving them, he comes down with judgment, and there's this handwriting on the wall. And it's kind of funny, because if you look at verse 5, it says, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstands. And the king saw the hand, and it wrote, and the king's color changed. Pay close attention to this. The king's color changed throughout, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The ESV is being very, very nice here.
Yeah,
because
I'm
literally
reading a different translation right here.
Yeah,
the CSB says, his face turned pale. His thoughts so terrified him that he soiled himself.
Yes, that's more literal. It's literally it's his loins came undone. And so think about this: these great kings that are oppressing God's people, right? They're oppressing God's people. This is giving us a picture of Belshazzar, this tyrant, literally pooping his pants like a little child, right? It's humiliating language, and that's what God does to the people who oppress His people. And so that is really kind of setting the stage for Daniel. And then you see Daniel in the lion's den, pretty straightforward there. Daniel chapter 7, 550 BC, kind of is the time period here in the first year of King Belshazzar. So it's stepping back in time. It's not straight chronological here, but you see here that there are 4 empires that rise, and what's happening is God is sovereign even in the midst of these empires. So, and that leads us to the Ancient of Days coming, the Son of Man coming to the Ancient of Days, and Jesus. I would highly encourage you to look this up, and how this is quoted in the New Testament. I don't have time here, but look how it's quoted in the New Testament. And then chapter 8, there is some amazing stuff here in chapter 8. How accurate that Daniel is, what he's saying here. How accurate it is to history that is coming. And so much so that people doubt Daniel's authorship because it is so accurate. But we know God is sovereign. He tells the prophets exactly what's going to happen. And then in Daniel 9, this is amazing. In Daniel 9, the first part. So Daniel and the exiles have been in exile for a long time. And Daniel has been faithful. The people have been faithful in exile. And Daniel's like, you know what? When is this going to end? Right? We see Daniel's character here. And as Daniel is meditating on God's word, and he goes back to in verse 2. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet must pass before the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. So he's referring back to Jeremiah 25:12 there. And then Daniel, in verse 3, then I turned my face to the Lord God, just like we've seen how he's done before. He's praying towards Jerusalem. Turn my face to the Lord God, seeking him by prayer and pleas of mercy with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. So we see here that there's lamentation that's going on. And I prayed to the Lord my God, and made my confession, O Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps covenants and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments. That is an allusion. That's not an allusion. That's a direct quotation of Deuteronomy 7:9. We have sinned and done what is wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled and turning aside from your commandments and rules. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets. Daniel is confessing his sin and the sins of the people. And I would just, verse 11, all Israel has transgressed your law and turned aside, refusing to obey your voice. And the curse and oath that are written in the law of Moses, the servant of God, have been poured out upon us, and we have sinned against him. That's Deuteronomy 28:15 through 68. So Daniel is well acquainted with the scriptures, and Daniel is repenting for his sins and the sins of his people. And I was just thinking as I was studying this, like, how powerful would this be if we saw ourselves like Daniel, and we all prayed like Daniel and sought to be faithful like Daniel. Man, it would be super powerful. And then the 70 weeks. There's no way we can trace out what is going on, but I would just encourage you to take this in tandem with Isaiah 53, 54, Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel's covenant of peace, and the temple vision, and take these as a whole and see and read these in stereo. And what Daniel is talking about in the 70 weeks here is what is happening, is the new covenant. Right. So if we would read all four of these texts in stereo, we would really feel the weight of the new covenant. And then 10, 12, Daniel is told what's going to happen in the future, and all of these. You've got a bunch of dudes. There's a lot of fighting that's going on here, a lot of bloodshed, but God is going to preserve his people. And then in 12, I haven't even talked about the allusion, what John references back in the book of Revelation to Daniel. It's pretty amazing. But anyway, we see that Daniel is at the end of Daniel, that there is this in Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12, at the end of verse 1, but at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found in the book, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to everlasting contempt. So Daniel is telling us that there is, we see eschatology like what we talked about in the Psalms. We see eschatology in Daniel, and this eschatology that Daniel is telling us, though in exile there is going to be wars and rumors of wars, to borrow Jesus' language, God's people are going to be delivered, right? And then we see here that verse 4, but you, O Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. We see that this is a big theme in the book of Revelation, that unsealing, when the book of Revelation comes about, and I would argue in 70 AD, that this is the time that the book is unsealed. So from Daniel until 70 AD, this book is sealed, and it's unsealed in 70 AD in the book of Revelation. So,
good job. That was a lot to fit in a single podcast. So, all right, that brings us to the end of this week's episode with the Bible Connection podcast. So I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who takes the time to listen every week. We just hope this podcast equips and encourages you as you read. So if you want to, leave a comment on YouTube if you have any questions, or you can send us an email with a question to the email on screen. So I hope you have a blessed day, and we'll be back with episode 39.